it so we can have it available for people who were not able to make it and attendees that want it for future reference. It is also being live streamed on your YouTube channel for those who were not able to log into the Zoom webinar. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the people upon whose land the Claudia Jones School exists. This is the land of the Nacotchtank people, from which the name Anacostia is drawn. The closest surviving First Nations people are the Piscataway Nation, which holds their annual celebrations in Accokeek, Maryland. With that being said, I will now introduce our fellow comrades, both Deborah Johnson and Gato Martinez Bentley, who will bring us to full attention with some creative expression. Deborah Sharon Johnson is a woman of God, mother, empath, spiritualist, revolutionary, truth seeker, writer, playwright, activist, and comedian. Gato Martinez Bentley is a spiritualist, father, teacher, world traveler, poet, grandfather, revolutionary Marxist, activist, performing artist, musician, playwright, director, producer, and Nubian Olmec. Together, they are founders of Salt of the Earth Theater Productions. They co-wrote, co-produced, and co-directed Half Our Story Has Never Been Told. Now, make welcome Deborah Johnson and Gato Martinez Bentley.
Good evening, friends. Hello. Gato and I have worked hard on this piece, and we feel that the ancestors have really spoken to us and are going to speak through us. Our spoken word piece is called Whirlwinds of Change. Come, take a journey with me. Envision what could be, what shall be. Feel the spirit of freedom ring, where we all succeed. We should aspire to live like the spirit of Harriet Tubman, who said, every great dream begins with a dreamer. Always remember, you have within you the strength, the patience, the passion, and the reach for the stars to change the world. The audacity of you, holding strong, staying true. The audacity to live your dreams, stronger than a love supreme. Although the pain has stained our past, for this too shall not last. As we finally become free at last, free at last. I now hear the horns of Coltrane blast. I am inspired by the courage of Paul Robeson, Benjamin Davis, Claudia Jones, Angela Davis, as well as Tupac Shakur. Great spirits alike, they have their Lord, whose courage inspires oneself to believe. We become a culture appropriation nation. We've gone from a whisper to screaming Black Lives Matter. Now hear this, for more than 400 scores ago, we were enslaved and our minds engraved with the indignities of our ancestors. As slaves, many have suffered from birth to the grave. Let your voices be heard from the school halls to city halls across the nation. We shall rock this cradle of indignation. I become a spirit of rebellion because white people don't see me. They think the audacity of you, holding strong, staying true, to live out your dreams. How supreme, to assume you're allowed to even have a dream. But in hearing, in my mind, let freedom ring. I hear the freedom in the flow of all time. I hear the beautiful melody of this rhyme. The audacity of you, holding strong, staying true. The audacity to live your dreams, stronger than a love supreme. Although the pain has stained our past, This too shall not last. We shall finally become free at last, free at last. Now hear the horns of Coltrane blast. We are in the midst of a perfect storm, a controversial change. It's time to unlock your minds to the falsehoods fed to us that still remain. From the decay of our rights delayed, we're now enduring great personal crisis across the globe. A crisis none have ever known or told. Take your knee off my neck. Your disrespect makes you subject. I can't breathe considering the crisis of capitalistic greed, denial of health, denial of economics, denial of climate change, and the surge of racial injustice. Woo! My spirit is overwhelmed. No justice, no peace. It's time for our rights to be released. No justice, no peace. It's time for our rights to be released. All eyes open. We've been bombarded with madness and hate that escapes our minds. We see grace. We're tired of being accosted by white supremacists, the currents of the world alike, coming at us full force, bringing great fright. We are being disarticulated and seeing the collapse of civilization as we thought it, and the return to barbarism. Something is missing. It's time to take a stand in this land called America, home of insecurity. It's time to let the ice melt away. Here we go. We don't need more prisons for profit and show. We need to liberate ourselves from our oppressors of 400 plus years of ongoing struggle to become symbols of resistance like the great Henry Winston, whose sight was stolen, yet he still had a vision. He fought the good fight with resistance and persistence. He was a man of substance, for he believed in things hoped for without evidence of things not seen. He spoke loud and clear, seeking emancipation, he said. We charge genocide, the historic petition to the United Nations for relief from a crime of the United States against Black people. He heard his spirit say, a change is gonna come.
Change is gonna come. Oh, yes, it will.
Oh, yes, it will. The audacity of you, holding strong, staying true. The audacity to live your dreams, stronger than the love supreme. Although the pain has stained our past, for this too shall not last. As we shall finally become free at last, free at last. And now hear the horns of Coltrane blast. Some have finally awakened, and they've seen what has shaken them to the core. Seeing how Agent Orange is pitting Americans against Americans, reminding us not only do we need to continually protest, we need to let our voices be heard. Word! It's time, I digest. I say give your time and hands to the struggle until we struggle no more. Speak up, even if you're nervous. Speak up, let your words be reminiscent, for the time has come. The audacity of you, holding strong, staying true. The audacity to live your dreams, stronger than the love supreme. Although the pain has stained our past, but this too shall not last, as we shall finally become free at last, free at last. I now hear the horns of Coltrane blast. Let's be heard and seen from the hills of Galilee down to the rivers of the Mississippi. For we are the original people from ancient times, not just fragments of your mind. Back from when dawn was just beginning, we are the salt of the earth, the son of the horn, a new inclusive being. From the Middle Passage to current day, living life anew, we bravely led the way. Our strength has seen us through, we lived it, we sang the blues. From Langston Hughes to Bojangles worn our shoes. Yet I too continue to sing the blues. What else can I do? For society is just starting to get a clue. The spoken word represents the voice and horns of our ancestral struggles for the many wrongs. Their names are injustice, imperialism, colonialism, fascism, and most importantly, systematic racism. That must be eradicated, which is seen from those who hate us, who hate on us. Open your eyes, open your ears, unspoken prayers, all to hear. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah and Gato.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, sister.
Cultural expression is so important. I'm going to ask people to put themselves back on mute so that we don't get additional noises while we hear from Professor Gerald Horne. And just give me a few moments to introduce our brother. Gerald Horne, historian and author, has published more than 30 books, including most recently, The Dawning of the Apocalypse, The Roots of Slavery, White Supremacy, Settler Colonialism and Capitalism in the Long 16th Century,
Over here.
which will be published this year, 2020. He is also the author of White Supremacy Confronted, U.S. Imperialism and Anti-Communism versus the Liberation of Southern Africa, from Rhodes to Mandela, 2019. This talk will be based on his previously published biographies of communist leaders, Ben Davis, William Paterson, Shirley Graham Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Ferdinand Smith, along with studies of the Communist Party in Hawaii and Hollywood. Good evening, Gerald Horne, and welcome to the Claudia Jones School for Political Education.
Well, good evening to you, and thank you for inviting me, and thank you to the previous cultural presentation. I appreciated that as well. And also, Lucy, I really appreciate your mentioning the First Nations whose land we are now all occupying. That's something we need to do more often, and I salute you for that sensitivity, quite frankly. Now, I only have 20 minutes to go over quite a bit of territory. So let me first tell you how I'm going to approach this subject. It'll be in three parts. The first part will examine the forces over centuries leading up to the formation of the US Communist Party after World War I, that is to say, post-1918, 1919. The second part will be a summary of how Black communists helped to remake and reshape the United States of America. And the third part, and hopefully the longest part, will be thumbnail sketches of a number of Black communists, including the ones that Lucy just mentioned, who I've written books about. The first part I will launch now, and the theme here is a theme that helps to understand how Black communists came into being in the 20th century. And that theme is internationalism. Let's say from the first arrival of enslaved Africans on these shores, what is now South Carolina in the 1580s, internationalism when the enslaved Africans broke away from their Spanish captors and defected to the Native American side, and then shaped the Spanish captors back to their perch on the Hispaniola, Haiti, and Dominican Republic. With the first expression of colonialism on the mainland of North America, with the establishment of Spanish settlements in Florida, which continues to exist, you saw that enslaved Africans played a central role there, and particularly the theme that will resonate for others, they collaborated with the inhabitants of their campus to try to become free. That is, they collaborated with the indigenous population of something that continued in the 19th century. They collaborated with the French. And this is, by the way, all documented in my book that Lucy mentioned in the introduction. And you see that as well with the arrival of the Londoners, the English, at the beginning of the 17th century, in what they call Virginia, you saw as well that enslaved Africans collaborated with the Spanish against the English up to and through the 18th century. And that includes the bloodiest slave revolt in the history of colonial North America, speaking of Stono's revolt in South Carolina in 1739, which was fundamentally a collaboration between enslaved Angolans in South Carolina and Black soldiers from Spanish Florida in uniform who came across the border to stir them up. Similarly, with the revolt against British rule that led to the foundation of the United States of America, historians generally agree that the enslaved Africans did not necessarily engage in class collaboration and stand with their slave masters, including George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Patrick Henry et al. That kind of collaboration against their slave masters continued during the War of 1812, where you saw the enslaved Africans in Washington, D.C. in August 1814 help the Redcoats to burn down Washington, D.C. and send President James Madison and his garrulous spouse, Dolly, scaring into the streets one step ahead of the posse, within the enslaved Africans becoming free and escaping on British boats to Trinidad and Tobago, where their descendants continue to reside. However, the central aspect of Black internationalism during this period was the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804.
Yeah, Gerald, there was an interruption when you talked about the Africans in Washington, D.C. And if you could go over that again, because there was an interruption and a freezing of the frame.
I only mentioned that in August 1814, when there was an invasion of the United States, after the United States tried to seize Canada and had its tail handed to it in response, the enslaved Africans in Washington, D.C. in August 1814 collaborated with the Redcoats in sacking and plundering Washington, D.C., sending President James Madison and his garrulous spouse, Dolly, scaring into the streets one step ahead of the posse, and then fled and escaped on British boats to Trinidad and Tobago, where their descendants continued to reside. But the central aspect of Black internationalism in this period was the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, which ignited a general crisis of the entire slave system that could only be resolved with its collapse, including in the United States in 1865. And of course, when these slave workers in Haiti, then in the United States, they were chains, this helped to set the stage for the rights of the labor movement in the United States. There's no accident that the labor movement and began to take off after 1865 with the abolition of slavery, with slavery serving as a drag on the wages and conditions of working people. However, to get to this for this evening, it's the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 that creates, symbolizes another crisis, this time of the entire capitalism, not these holds in 2020. And it also sets the stage for the arrival in the United States of of the US Communist Party. And you need to realize the world historic importance of these events. Go back to some territory I just reversed. When you had the arrival of enslaved Africans in the 1500s, this is a religious conflict, particularly between Protestants and Catholics, and also between the Christian and Jewish population. However, with the rise of the African slave trade in the 17th and 18th century, you have the arrival on this scene in particular of a very putrid and despicable racism targeting not only people of African descent, but the indigenous population as well. However, with the 20th century and the arrival of the Bolshevik Revolution, you have the arrival of the class project. And the class project, that is to say the working class in power, that is to say empowering unions on these shores, was particularly attractive to many Black people who were trying to escape the ravages and devastation of racism. Now, with regard to the US Communist Party, the points I would like to mention is, first of all, its initiative to suggest that Black people in the United States, at least this was the early position, constituted an oppressed nation, particularly with regard to the so-called Black Belt of the US South, that was worthy of self-determination. That eventually was not, was jettisoned, shall we say. But the main theme, of course, is organizing against racism, which brings me to the Scottsboro case, which I've argued marked a turning point against Jim Crow in the United States, insofar as, and this brings me to a major point, that with the Scottsboro case, you saw the International Labor Defense and the Communist Party of the United States, which had helped to bring it into being, were able to draw upon an international network of communist parties and like-minded people all over the world. And they organized a global campaign against Jim Crow and racism through the Scottsboro case, which, by the way, involved 9 Black youth in Alabama in March 1931 who were arrested and were accused falsely of sexual molestation of 2 Euro-American women on the fast track to electrocution before the International Labor Defense and the Communist Party intervened and organized this worldwide movement, which puts Jim Crow in the spotlight, not unlike the worldwide movement that helped to erode South African apartheid in the 1970s and the 1980s. And it was that kind of internationalism which drew upon centuries of past internationalism, particularly solidarity with the Haitian Revolution, that set the stage for the arrival of more Black communists into the ranks of the US Communist Party. However, post-World War II, which on the one hand involves the United States and the Soviet Union and the United States North Atlantic allies, including Britain, confronting Germany, Japan, Italy et al., with the conclusion of World War II, you saw the United States turn on its erstwhile ally in Moscow, which initiates the Red Scare. And that Red Scare is accompanied by increased pressure on the United States because the United States was trying to charge Moscow with human rights violations, found it difficult as long as people of African descent in particular were treated so atrociously. So this creates a dynamic whereby during the midst of the Red Scare in 1954, you see the US Supreme Court and the Brown versus Board of Education decision say, you know what, Jim Crow is unconstitutional and illegal, even though they had said the exact opposite in the 1890s. However, the trick bag that they put us into was at the same time Jim Crow was retreating, they put communist leaders, particularly Black communist leaders, under pressure, not least William Paterson, who served a stint in jail. He, of course, was a leader of the Scottsboro case in the 1930s. And so you saw this contradiction whereby Jim Crow was retreating as the most sophisticated leadership was under pressure and oftentimes being jailed. This leads to this contradiction whereby people of African descent win the right ultimately to go to any restaurant that they so choose to, but because of the attack on unions and on communists during the same period, they oftentimes find themselves without the income to pay the check when it arrives at the dinner table. And I'm afraid to say we're still enmeshed in that contradiction that has yet to be resolved, which in many ways is part of a larger unresolved contradiction, which is the legacy of slavery. That is to say, the meshing of the legacy of slavery with the legacy of Jim Crow. Now, with that, now let me turn to these sketches. I mentioned William Paterson, born in the 1890s in San Francisco, a graduate of the University of California, including its law school, on the fast track to fame and fortune, but like his good friend Paul Robeson, who we helped to introduce and influence to the left, he decides that individual accomplishment is insufficient, and he joins the Communist Party in the 1920s, studies at the party school in Moscow, in addition to doing this yeoman labor on behalf of the Scottsboro Nine and that global campaign. He also is an operative for the Communist International headquartered in Moscow in the underground in Germany against fascist Hitler, fascist Germany in the 1930s. He eventually leads the Civil Rights Congress, which is sort of a successor to the International Labor Defense that spearheaded the Scottsboro case. And in that capacity, along with Robeson, they file a petition at the United Nations charging the United States with genocide against Black people. This is part of the international pressure that causes Washington to determine that the better part of wisdom is to retreat agonizingly from the more atrocious aspects of Jim Crow. Interestingly enough, we just had a replay of what Paterson, the CRC, and Robeson attempted just a few weeks ago, when the African Union, headquartered in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, filed a motion at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, Switzerland, calling for a commission of inquiry into, quote, systemic racism, unquote, in the United States of America. Press reports indicate that the United States could be metaphorically seen during this period a few weeks ago like a duck on the pond. It seemed to be sailing along placidly, but beneath the surface, its feet were paddling furiously. Because even though it did not try to bring attention to this motion, beneath the surface, the United States was lobbying, twisting arms, threatening, cajoling, perhaps even bribing to make sure that this motion did not pass. But I think that that was a very telling signal that I hope our movement follows up on. In any case, Paterson caps his illustrious career by fundamentally leading the defense of Angela Davis, who I'm sure I don't have to tell this audience about, in the 1970s when she's on trial, a trial that once again was internationalized, which then brings pressure on the US authorities to back down. The other communist leader I would like to mention this evening is Benjamin Davis Jr., an Atlantan, and in fact, before 1950, the Davis family was probably more prominent in Atlanta than the King family. Davis was a lawyer. He catapulted into prominence by a case not dissimilar than the Scottsboro case, speaking of the Angelo Herndon case, a young Communist League organizer who's arrested for violating certain statutes that are violative of the First Amendment. During the process of that trial, he joins the Communist Party, moves to New York, elected to the New York City Council from Harlem in 1943, replacing Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who moves to Washington to represent that district in Congress. Davis reelected in 1945, unceremoniously, if not illegally, ousted in 1949, jailed by 1951 at federal prison in Terre Haute, Indiana. which is part of that process of trying to beat down the Black communists as certain concessions are doled out, certain anti-Jim Crow concessions are doled out. Benjamin Davis Jr., as you know, becomes a top leader of the Communist Party in the 1950s before passing away in the 1960s. And then there's Ferdinand Smith, an exemplar of the Black immigrant communists, insofar as he was born in Jamaica, becomes a founder of one of the most powerful unions in the United States of America, speaking of the National Maritime Union, these workers aboard ships who fundamentally have control and oversight of both imports and exports, imports into the United States and exports from the United States. He is the #2 leader, is very close even to certain top New Dealers of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration in Washington. But once again, he falls victim to the Red Scare as well. Is sent back to Jamaica in the early 1950s, not unlike Claudia Jones, who is ousted from the United States and then winds up in London. But Ferdinand Smith then goes on to play a preeminent role in the movement that leads to Jamaican independence by 1962, which was a very powerful anti-colonial statement by both Jamaica and Ferdinand Smith. I should also mention Shirley Graham Du Bois and W.E.B. Du Bois. I'm sure that W.E.B. Du Bois needs no introduction to this audience, although I should reference here that his roots are on the island of Hispaniola, which nowadays contains Haiti, which gives him a connective tissue to the Black internationalism of the early 19th century and the Black internationalism of the 20th century. He, of course, was born in Massachusetts, 1868, founds the NAACP in 1909, writes many books, teaches at Atlanta University, returns to the NAACP in the 1940s, ousted by the NAACP leadership by 1948 on Red Scare anti-communist grounds, put on trial at the age of 83 as the United States authorities tried to jail him. But once again, a mass movement keeps that from happening. And then in 1961, as he's about to go into exile in Kwame Nkrumah's Ghana in West Africa, where he is now buried, he joins the US Communist Party. In that regard, he was probably influenced by his second spouse, Shirley Graham Du Bois, who may be well considered one of the top, if not the top, Black women intellectuals of the 20th century, a graduate of Oberlin College and Yale School of Drama, a playwright, a novelist, a biographer, and activist with the NAACP in the 1940s when his membership shoots from 40,000 to 400,000. That's in many ways under her guidance. But like so many, I know this is becoming to sound repetitive, she's part of the Communist Party and then of course is under pressure during the Red Scare and then moves with W.E.B. Du Bois to Ghana, where he of course dies in 1963. She continues on until Nkrumah is overthrown by a CIA-engineered coup in 1966, which sends her into exile in Cairo, Egypt. She dies in China, People's Republic of China in the 1970s. So just to sum up and to conclude, the role of Black communists in the 20th century has been central and essential. This comes forth particularly during the Scottsboro case of the 1930s, but I think it also comes forth with regard to organizing of trade unions, not least the National Maritime Union. And certainly if this country is to escape the poisonous snare of Trumpism in 2020, and if this country is able to cash legitimately that promissory note that Martin Luther King talked about in 1963 in the March on Washington, we recall him talking about how the note came back insufficient funds. If that promissory note is to be acknowledged and paid, not least through a dedicated program of reparations, certainly we're going to have the dedicated energy and enthusiasm and activism of Black communists walking in the footsteps of Shirley Graham Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, Ben Davis, Ferdinand Smith, William Paterson. Excuse me for not mentioning others, but my time was limited. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Gerald Horne. You've given us a lot to think about. I know I used to wonder about the War of Independence in this country. And, you know, I was supposed to be on the side of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, but at the same time, my family, our roots are from Virginia. And so we know that this was the site of genocide and slavery. And so when you came out with the book, which said, or actually various writings of yours, which have said that the true revolutionary war was the war in Haiti for independence, and that the war here was counter-revolutionary. And then all of a sudden it seemed to come together that, oh yes, and we're still supporting the counter-revolutionaries in Nicaragua and in other places. I was wondering if, well, what I'd like to ask you about is something today. I read that Angela Davis is encouraging people to support Biden. And that kind of twisted me because do we vote for, or do we allow Trump to regain the White House and possibly have racist militia running rampant? Or do we vote Biden in and go back to sleep the way we were under Obama? What do we do?
Well, I can't say you're tossing me softballs. I would act like King Solomon and split the baby in half. That is to say that, as you know, we have this electoral college in the United States of America, as Hillary Rodham Clinton could well tell you, and as Al Gore could well tell you, just because you get the most votes in a US presidential election does not mean that you will win. You are sitting in Washington, DC. There is not a snowball's chance in hell that the oath in the Oval Office will receive the electoral college votes from Washington, DC. The same could be said for New York. The same could be said for California. The same could be said for the entire Pacific coast. So I think it's well past time for us to build as we fight. That is to say that we should take advantage of these contradictions in the electoral system and try to build alternatives to the status quo as we're fighting against the status quo. Now, if you are in the so-called swing state, you may want to follow the advice that you just offered. But I haven't looked at the polls in Mississippi lately, but if history is any guide, Mississippi will stay red, as they say, on the cable news channels in 2020. But you may want to check the polls before you cast your vote. So in any case, I think it depends on where you live. And if you live in California, where Hillary Rodham Clinton beat Trump by 3 million votes in 2016, and probably he'll lose California by that total or more, I understand why you might want to opt for an alternative to the two-party system.
And of course, people say that the elections are not where we should be focused anyway. What suggestions do you have for us? Where should we really be putting our energy?
Well, I mean, I think the election should be focused on. I mean, I think that during the electoral calendar, every 2 years, every 4 years, people oftentimes tend to focus on who are their representatives in a way that they don't focus on during off years. So I think that should be just another tool in our toolkit, but certainly elections should not be privileged over every other aspect of struggle. That is to say, elections should be seen as complementary to every other aspect of struggle, including organizing at the workplace, organizing in the neighborhood with regard to this catastrophe that we're facing in a few weeks concerning evictions from the Atlantic through the Pacific, organizing in terms of schools and colleges, given all the problems that are there, organizing in the streets with regard to these protests against police terror. So I would not juxtapose elections against these other forms of struggle.
We have a question. The level of imperialist expansion appears to be increasing as the presidential election approaches. So is this a normal activity around elections when the person in as president is in trouble of losing an election, or is the next step to go to war?
Well, that's another good question. I noticed that just in the last 24 hours, the Oath in the Oval Office has issued threats against Venezuela. If you look at the recently published best-selling memoir by his sacked National Security Advisor, John Bolton, The Room Where It Happened, you'll find out that the attempted coup against the government in Venezuela was basically cooked up in the White House. And I would argue as well that the so-called Bay of Piglets of May 2020, when there was this invasion of Venezuela just a few weeks ago, was also cooked up in the White House. Mr. Bolton says that even though he was to the right of Mr. Trump on virtually every other issue, Mr. Trump was to his right on the question of Venezuela. And that's something we should take very seriously. We should also take seriously the fact that both Bolton and Trump seem to suggest that but for the assistance of Cuba, Russia, and China, they say they would have been successful in toppling Maduro. I'm not sure if that's accurate, but that's what's animating their thinking, which of course brings us to Cold War II with China, which is becoming ever more serious with every passing day. As we speak, you have the USS Reagan and the USS Nimitz sailing dangerously close to Chinese territorial waters in the South China Sea. You have a new organization coming into being, the D10, which is the group of 7, the North Atlantic countries plus Japan, adding South Korea, Australia, and India, which is a new cabal designed to encircle China. And once again, per your question, I don't see this as being accidental that is taking place during this electoral season. Being a person in Texas, I recognize that the Republican Party, in order to gain office, oftentimes has a coalition that includes ultra-rightist, ultra-fascist elements that are oftentimes like the tail that wags the dog. The Republican office holders feel they oftentimes have to bow down to these elements. And certainly when you see the racist rhetoric being used against China with regard to COVID-19 and the corona flu, the terms I will not repeat that he has used, but it's obviously an attempt to whip up racist sentiment, to whip up ultra-rightist sentiment, which apparently is already in motion. I'm sure you're following the stories about the Boogaloo Boys, about how in Philadelphia, I'm sure we have people from Philadelphia, how the police union was just caught meeting with the Proud Boys, this fascist organization, meeting the head of the police union in Philadelphia to give this weak-kneed apology, or a non-apology, I should say, for this transgression. So yes, we are sailing in very dangerous waters now, and I think it's precisely because we're in an election year.
I don't want us to leave the discussion about Venezuela. I think people may not be aware that Venezuela has gold, has finances that it cannot touch. What can be done about that?
Well, that's a very good question. I know that the regime in Caracas tried to retrieve it. They proved to be unsuccessful, but it's in London. And London right now is in a very ticklish position because on the one hand, it's exiting the European Union. That is to say, it doesn't, is presumably will not have as much solidarity with France, Germany, et cetera, particularly since it seems as if London is setting itself up to be a kind of Yankee outpost on the shores of Western Europe. And on the other hand, that has caused London to now worsen relations with China in terms of offering citizenship to people who want to come to Hong Kong. They're offering 200,000 Hong Kongers citizenship, even though we were told that anti-immigration was a main reason for Brexit, the British exit from the European Union. At the same time, London just announced today that it's not going forward with his previous deal with Huawei, the Chinese telecommunications giant, which is in the crosshairs right now. The daughter of the founder is under house arrest in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, at the behest of Washington. So I'm sure Caracas does not have to be told that in order to get its goal out of London, it needs to push those pressure points. It needs to push those pressure points against London, particularly vis-a-vis China in particular, which has really been issuing non-too-veiled threats to Britain as we speak.
I've been listening to some discussions of Africans from continental Africa and the diaspora, and I find it interesting to hear the criticisms of China and the criticisms of the former Soviet Union, and sort of the lack of criticism of the CIA. I was wondering if you might have any comments on something some people call the Afro-derecha.
Now, who are these criticisms coming from now? What elements?
From African intellectuals.
African-American intellectuals.
And African intellectuals.
Oh, I see. Because I've been following this question, and I see it mostly coming from African-Americans. In terms of Africans, I don't see it coming necessarily from the leadership, that is to say anti-China sentiment. Now, of course, a critique of China can be made, and if any of you are interested in what the critique is, look at my book on Southern Africa, look at my book on Zimbabwe, look at my book on Shirley Graham Du Bois, and you'll get a glimpse, and I can summarize it if anybody's interested. But today, it seems to me that sort of approach is misguided. When Cold War II has erupted, when the United States is rattling its saber at China, when the leadership in African countries, in particular the Caribbean, as noted, they welcome Chinese assistance as a counterweight to the exploitation of the North Atlantic countries, not least France. I always wonder why people don't talk about France in Africa, which is the major vampire with regard to sucking the lifeblood out of the continent, whose pretensions to being a major power basically rest upon its exploitation, its cruel exploitation of countries like Mali and Senegal and Mauritania and all the rest. And it's very curious, I must say, that this imperialist country seems to escape criticism, whereas the country that's trying to counter France, even in the eyes of African leaders who might not be progressive, that is to say, there's this critique of China, but not France, and not necessarily even of the United States.
Yes, well, we have a number of questions here. Let me, well, this is an interesting question. How did the Haitian Revolution impact Marxist socialist analysis at the time?
At the time? Well, the Haitian Revolution concludes in 1804. Karl Marx was born in 1818.
That's
However,
what I thought.
Having said that, I think you can get a glimpse of how the Haitian Revolution, as my comments suggested, influences labor organizing and gives a shot in the arm to the labor movement, not only in the United States, but I would argue worldwide, how that happens during the course of the 19th century. And of course, my book on the subject is Confronting Black Jacobins, the United States, the Haitian Revolution, and the Origins of the Dominican Republic.
Yes. your comment regarding the end of Jim Crow and the fact that African Americans cannot afford to eat at a restaurant reminds me of the situation of Blacks in South Africa after the end of apartheid. Afrikaners still had much control of capital. Would you speak to this?
Well, you know, that's a subject I take up in my book that you mentioned in the introduction, White Supremacy Confronted. One of the ironies of the freedom of Nelson Mandela in February 1990, the unbanning simultaneously of the South African Communist Party, the African National Congress in February 1990, is that it comes weeks after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, with the final apartheid leader, F.W. de Klerk, making it clear that these events are connected. That is to say, he felt that with the erosion and strength of the socialist camp, that the African National Congress would have to accept a deal that might be otherwise considered to be unpalatable, because after all, South Africa is a relatively small country of about 55 million. Its GDP is hardly the size of the Netherlands, which is not even a giant in the European Union. And without the ability of the socialist camp to help to serve as a backstop for the economy, it was going to be clear that with Nelson Mandela's election in 1994, that there would be rough sledding ahead. Having said that, I do think that a mistake was made when Nelson Mandela stepped down after a 6-year term, replaced by Thabo Mbeki, a former South African Communist Party leader and of course an ANC leader. And then he was forced out and replaced by Jacob Zuma. This happens at the behest, in fact, I'm afraid to say, of forces on the left. I think that that was not a step forward. And arguably, South Africa has yet to recover. And of course, Jacob Zuma, in some ways, is an analog to Trump. That is to say that just as Trump has to hold on to power in order to try to avoid criminal prosecution, Jacob Zuma was trying to hold on to power. And of course, he is now facing the prospect of criminal prosecution because precisely he was forced out of office.
Coming back over to this side of the Atlantic, what international forces exist today that are powerful enough to transform the internal dynamics of the US the way the USSR had in the past?
Well, that's a good question. Well, you know, I'm sure the questioner would also envision a role for these strugglers in the United States in this process, because of course, we are the ones who make history, but of course we make it with the cloth in hand. And the cloth oftentimes is sewn or provided, or at least shaped by international forces. Quite frankly, even though China is in the passing lane right now, which is one of the reasons why it's in the crosshairs, that is to say, its economy, by some measures, is already larger than that of the United States. The United States feels that one advantage that it does have is the military advantage, in that this is a declining asset that has to be used sooner rather than later if it's to basically hold its value, which therefore helps to explain this dangerous situation we're now facing in the South China Sea. I do think that going forward, US imperialism will be under tremendous pressure, not only from China and Cuba and Venezuela, and pay close attention to the latest China-Iran deal, just reported in the New York Times yesterday. And so I think that the correlation of forces in some ways is shifting against US imperialism. The question is, are strugglers in the United States able to take advantage of the international situation? And to be frank, candid, and honest, I'm not sure as to what the answer to that question is.
How do we counter a Biden administration that seems to be willing to demonize the Venezuelan government in the same way that the Trump administration does?
Well, obviously, we should keep our powder dry. Obviously, we should stay in the streets. Obviously, we should build our peace and anti-imperialist forces. Obviously, we should be extending hands of solidarity across the oceans and across the borders. Obviously, there should be, there was just a virtual seminar that either is about to take place or just took place between movements in Venezuela and movements in the United States of America. Those kinds of efforts, that kind of international solidarity has to be strengthened. And I would also say that with regard to strengthening our forces, we really need to get our forces in the Organization of American States, headquartered in your own Washington, D.C., to file a motion on systemic racism in the OAS, similar to the one filed by the African Union at the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. That's a way to strengthen our forces, as it is also a way to weaken the antagonists we're now confronting.
Another question, please speak on the importance of the history you are uncovering on settler colonialism and primitive accumulation, construction of capitalism, USA, for us communists in the USA. At our core, we embrace concepts like the centrality of the fight against racism and working class internationalism. Your narrative builds on Aptheker, Foner, and others, but we must say you have broken new ground. Please speak on this, comrade, what it means for our party during this moment.
Oh, that was from my mother. Thank you very much, Mom. No, I mean, I do think we need more analyses of settler colonialism. While we have not, at least to my knowledge, had as many analyses of settler colonialism up to this point, I think is both disappointing and shocking. In that regard, let me reiterate my thank you to Lucy Murphy, who in her introduction gave a shout out to the indigenous population of what is now Washington, D.C. And I trust and I hope that all of you pay careful and close attention to the US Supreme Court decision just a few days ago that fundamentally suggested that half of Oklahoma is indigenous land and indigenous territory. Perhaps that may even cause us to rethink one of our central anthems, interestingly enough, written by an Oklahoman, Woody Guthrie, that is to say, this land is your land, this land is my land, as opposed to, no, this land is their land, and this is a settler colonial project with issues yet to be unresolved with regard to justice to the original inhabitants of this soil, although a bit of justice once again came in Washington, D.C., when the professional football team, under severe pressure, was forced to drop the racist slur, the name I will not repeat, you can find it online, I'm sure. And that was a very important victory. Next in the crosshairs, of course, is the Cleveland Indians baseball team. And if anybody from Ohio is on this call, I trust that you're aware of the controversy there. And certainly with regard to primitive accumulation, I mean, it's clear that what served as a central building block for this horrendous system known as capitalism was the African slave trade. I mean, this is not an original idea. You can argue that it goes back to Karl Marx himself. You could say that the point was embroidered by Walter Rodney of Guyana, Eric Williams of Trinidad and Tobago, Joseph Inakori of Nigeria, now at the University of Rochester, and of course myself, because the African slave trade was one of the most lucrative enterprises known to humankind. You can invest $1, get $1,700 back, and there are those today, at least on Wall Street, who would sell their firstborn for a 1,700% profit, not to mention some African they did not know. And then the African slave trade led to spin-off industries, such as an insurance industry, because you had to ensure that the Africans would not revolt and throw everybody overboard and sail the ship back to Africa. And of course, the ships themselves had to be built at docks in England and Scotland in particular. And that helps to create a working class, which then, in a sort of circle of consumerism, then can buy other products that other workers are producing. And then, of course, these ships are used to bring settlers across the Atlantic to settle what they call Virginia by 1607. So I'm sure I don't have to tell this audience what I imagine you already know.
We have another question that deals with the organizing for the Scottsboro Boys. It begins with, you say that the US Revolution in 1776 was not a bourgeois democratic revolution. So what was it in the Marxist sense? Was it relatively progressive, or was that not the case because they were not fighting any feudal kings and lords in their own stolen land? Do you think the revolution of radical reconstruction plays any particularly significant role in how communists today understand how to make revolution here? Also, in Mark Nason's Communists in Harlem during the Great Depression, the Communist Party had a lot of influence in the Black community because of their efforts in leading the Scottsboro case, but they failed to recruit a wide strata of the Black working class. Why do you think that was?
Well, I'm not so sure about the latter point with regard to failing to recruit a wide swath of the Black working class. And of course, the book you just referenced only looks at Harlem, doesn't look at Philadelphia or Washington, D.C., Baltimore, St. Louis, Chicago, et cetera. Alabama. With regard to the events of 1776, well, let me ask a question of my own. There was a settler revolt in what is now Zimbabwe in November of 1965. Ian Smith, the leader of the racist Rhodesian Front, claimed that he was walking in the footsteps of 1776 because just as he was trying to evade London seeking to implant one person, one vote, an African majority rule, he said that London was trying to implant abolition of slavery per Somerset's case, 1772. The settlers, led by real estate speculator number one, George Washington, revolted in 1776. Ian Smith revolted in 1965. Speaking of real estate speculator, we should not forget, once again, the Native American question. That is to say that in the Royal Proclamation of 1762, 1763, London expressed displeasure at continuing to expend blood and treasure, moving west, seizing the land of Native Americans and turning it over to real estate speculators like George Washington, was probably the biggest landowner in the settlements, in the colonies, and probably the biggest landowner in the New Republic. Likewise, with regard to analogies, I wonder what the questioner would say about the settlers' revolt in Algeria in the late 1950s, as Algeria was moving to independence, with the settlers even going so far as to try to topple the regime of Charles de Gaulle in Paris. Of course, that settlers' revolt was squashed. And I wonder what would be said about the so-called Anglo-Boer War, 1899 to 1902, where once again you have a revolt against British rule. The Africans, of course, by several orders of magnitude, just like the Africans in 1776, do not support the settlers. And I wonder what the questioner would say about the Africans who did not support George Washington. Were they counter-revolutionaries since they didn't support their slave owners? Were they counter-revolutionaries because they could easily envision the fact that the settlers would continue moving west, seizing the land of Native Americans, stocking it with enslaved Africans? And of course, by the 1790s, the United States was in control of the slave trade to Cuba. A very curious, great leap forward for humanity. By 1840s, they were in control of the slave trade to Brazil, the largest slave market of all. Look at my book, The Deepest South, United States, Brazil, and the African Slave Trade. And returning once again to the so-called Anglo-Boer War, the Africans, of course, did not support the settlers, but alas, what happens is that the settlers were defeated, but then kissed and made up with the colonial power. And then, of course, that led to apartheid by 1948. And then we have a control group. What about Canada across the border? That is to say that Canada didn't revolt against British rule, for example. Yet, I keep hearing that Canada has a kind of healthcare system, which it seems to me is the essential of what you try to do for your populace, not least your working class populace, by having a single payer healthcare system. Yet the so-called revolutionary republic fundamentally has a pay or die system, which now helps to explain why COVID-19 has cut a prodigious swath in terms of mortality throughout the entire Black population. And what about the dog that didn't bark? Florida was under British rule in 1776. Florida didn't revolt against London. Why is that? It may have something to do with pre-existing Spanish rule, whereby, as noted in my discussion of Stono's revolt, where you had Black soldiers, because there was a religious qualifier for settlement in the Spanish settlements, whereas the English took this pan-European approach. That is to say, those who they were warring with, as I talk about in my 16th century book, Irish Catholics, they expelled the Jewish population in 1291, then welcomed them as settlers because they were under the gun by the 1500s. And so the Africans in Florida, they made sure that Florida did not revolt and join George Washington and the slave owners. And then when the United States managed to oust the Spanish by 1819, 1820, when Florida joins the Union, where it remains to this very day, there was a steady stream of ships sailing southward to Cuba because they knew what was in store for them if they came under the jurisdiction of the slave owners. My friends, it's well past time when we're under the gun, when none of us can say for certain that Trump will be defeated in November, to get rid of these nostrums. I was thinking the other day, in some ways, the Supreme Court, with its decision that half of Oklahoma is Native American soil, and of course the details have to be worked out, needless to say, in some ways they've gone to the left of many of our friends on the US left, who rarely talk about how this land was obtained in the first instance. So, don't get me started. In any case, yes. So if you think Algeria was a revolution when the settlers tried to overthrow France in 1959 because they were going against this major imperialist power, fine. If you think that Rhodesia, November 1965 was a revolution, even though the Africans didn't support it, because they were going against a major imperialist power in London, fine. That's your business. I'll leave you to explain that to the Algerians and the Zimbabweans today.
Can you speak to the modern situation of the revolutionary communist movement, and more generally within the context of the recent wave of protests under organizations such as Black Lives Matter, or the movement for Black Lives?
Well, it's a very curious moment we're facing right now. On the one hand, press reports tell us that with demonstrations from the Atlantic through the Pacific, in places like Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and Iowa, et cetera, this might be the biggest mass movement in US history. However, the Black Lives Matter movement, which, as you know, is a decentralized movement, and I see that decentralization as a response to what happened to centralized organizations like the Black Panther Party, which were bludgeoned into submission. Their leaders were arrested, jailed, killed, etc. And of course, it had international affiliates in places like Algeria. So I see this decentralized Black Lives Matter movement as a kind of response to that centralized model and what befell it. The only question is, will that centralization be able to carry the day? I mean, for example, you have these curious episodes of people adapting the moniker Black Lives Matter and using it to engage in fraudulent activity, like raising money with the money going to who knows where. But I think that rather than some of our friends on the left who stand on the sidelines and throw spitballs at that particular movement, I think that we should be part of that movement and try to assist this movement, because typically in the United States of America, the land of counter-revolution, the counter-revolution is already beginning. I mean, it's not only the fact that we have new terms introduced into our vocabulary, like vehicular terrorism. That is to say, when officers of the law and civilians drive their cars into peaceful protesters, leading to a death in Seattle just a few days ago. You recall that this reared its ugly head in Charlottesville, Virginia in August 2017. You have the spectacle of people getting their eyes damaged by rubber bullets and other projectiles shot by the police. You've had this curious spectacle of Black men hanging from trees or attempting to get them to hang from trees. Is what happened in Indiana just a few days ago. And to cap off this counter-revolutionary process, which, by the way, is motoring ahead, even though we have, they started the counter-revolution already, which should tell you something. You have this very curious document that appears in Harper's Magazine that rails against what's called cancel culture. This is, to put it in language we can understand, this is when our movement objects to sexist and racist in positions of power and try to do something about it. So you had all of these prominent artists and intellectuals, I won't mention their names, you can easily Google it and find out, and they object to cancel culture, which, by the way, was a term also used by the bow-tied popinjay who writes for your local paper, the Washington Post, speaking of George Will, who denounced cancel culture in his column just a few days ago, which he blamed on, quote, lumpen intelligentsia, unquote. That may mean people like yourself and myself, by the way. But in any event, this curious document, which basically mimics the rhetoric of the right wing, was engineered by two curious suspects. One, Mark Lilla, a professor at an Ivy League university, who after Trump was elected in November 2016, wrote an entire book saying, you know how Trump got elected? Because of Black Lives Matter. He said, what? They probably voted against Trump 9-1, or maybe even 10-0. So how do you figure that one? Well, it's because it's Black identity politics, and the Euro-American majority across class lines got so upset by this Black identity politics, they marched this one to the ballot box and voted for Trump. All right, whatever. Then the other engineer of this curious document was Thomas Chatterton Williams, who could fairly be described as a light-skinned Negro who lives in France, who wrote a whole book lamenting the fact that he is defined as Black. Boo-hoo, boo-hoo. I mean, there are worse fates after all. But in any case, this document got many luminaries to sign it, which is a very troubling and dangerous signal. And once again, I think that rather than inadvertently join the ranks of the counter-revolutionaries, we should be joining the ranks of these folks in the streets. And if we have any questions about their process and about their organization, we should just have a heart-to-heart conversation about it.
We have another question. Do you think building a multinational communist party is ceding ground to white chauvinism? How did the Communist Party in its heyday deal with that question, correctly or incorrectly? And what guidance do you think Black communists of the 20th century could teach us today about building multinational unity? Please speak to how the role of Africa and Africans played a role in how the Comintern correctly oriented the US counterparts.
Well, with regard to the latter, what's interesting, I made a reference in my opening remarks to the Black Belt thesis. And this was a thesis, I've already defined it, but it was not just a project of Black communists in the Communist International. There was a lot of input from communists from South Africa and communists from all over the world with regard to this particular thesis. I think I must have misheard. Read the first two sentences of the question again.
Do you think building a multinational communist party is ceding ground to white chauvinism?
Well, I don't understand that question.
I'm just reading what they, yeah, okay.
I would hope that it's combating, quote, white chauvinism, unquote. I would hope so.
How did the Communist Party in its heyday deal with that question correctly or incorrectly? And what guidance do you think Black communists of the 20th century could teach us today about building multinational unity?
Well, with regard to the historical question, which I think I'm more competent to answer, you know, there were trials. I mean, I'm sure you heard of the trial that took place where an alleged white chauvinist was put on trial with a prosecutor and a defense attorney. And then, if I recall correctly, the alleged perpetrator was convicted of white chauvinism and therefore had to pay a stiff penalty.
This was a trial within the party.
Correct. Mm-hmm. Yes. Far be it from me to bring coals to Newcastle and try to make recommendations as to how the Communist Party should conduct its business today. But certainly that is an example, and as the questioner said or implied, for better or for worse, those were the kinds of stern measures that were used. I think also, even from based on this conversation and based on what I already know, I think that it would be useful not only for the Communist Party, but I would say the US progressive movement in general. And actually, I see this to a degree in the US progressive movement, to do an agonizing reappraisal of US history and not to necessarily accept the nostrums of the past. I mean, it's some of our folks today, to me, it's almost the equivalent of in the 1950s when Crick, Watson, and Franklin come up with DNA. They say, oh, Darwin didn't talk about DNA, so we'll give you the right to talk about DNA. I mean, it's sort of a scientific method, supposedly, you know, there's development. I mean, there's evolution. It's not a catechism. I mean, it's not just you know, certain pat phrases that are repeated. And then with regard to the historical project, I hope we know that history advances because new records emerge, new archives emerge all over the world, which gives us new insight into past developments. And I would hope, you know, I found that we had a very interesting episode, by the way, with the 1619 Project of the New York Times Magazine, August 2019. Mm-hmm. If you know from what I said, I don't necessarily accept that 1619 date, but in any case, I thought that the critique that was made in the bourgeois press about the origin of the United States, which caused a firestorm of controversy from establishment historians, from so-called Trotskyist historians, I thought was very telling, because in some ways you had these Black journalists at the New York Times struggling to understand this very peculiar and unique history of the United States with these processes you don't necessarily see in other countries where there are Black people, like lynching, for example. I mean, how do you reconcile that in the so-called revolutionary republic, these atavistic primitive practices that you don't necessarily see in other post-slavery societies, for example? And so here you have these Black journalists in the New York Times swimming against the tide because the historians don't necessarily provide guidance in this regard. As a matter of fact, they denounced, you should see some of the comments that was made by the sister, Nicole Hannah-Jones, of the 1619 Project. They were ugly, they were sexist, they were racist. It was quite extraordinary. And I think part of it has to do with the fact that when those who purport to be the engineers of society, the scientists of society, are not moving forward with the science, that it can cause problems. Because other people are not going to say, okay, I'm going to wait until they come up. Wait till they come up with an idea, then I'll read it and adapt it. Then they try to come up with their own ideas. And sometimes it has flaws, even chronologically. But then again, once again, I think that that should not be the end of the story.
I'd like you to comment on 1619, because I'm a member of something called the DC Afro-Latino Caucus. And we know that African people did not start coming here in 1619.
Well, I made reference to that.
They came before.
I made reference to that in my opening remarks. It's in my book that you so kindly mentioned in your introduction. But once again, if folks start to fixate on 1619, a lot of it has to do with what the historians have written. And so the critique should be of these historians, many of whom are, they're making six-figure salaries, sometimes more. That's where the critique should be lodged. Not necessarily at these journalists who are trying to figure out this complicated reality.
We have a question that mentions labor unions. What is your take on the current situation with the obvious rising movements against racism, including large sections of the labor movement, communities joining with Black Lives Matter and other racially oppressed people, including Native peoples? To me, it feels even stronger with more potential for real change than even the civil rights movement, which brought me and thousands of young activists at the time into the Communist Party.
Well, I would like to think so. I mean, certainly there are some exciting developments taking place. And of course, these developments significantly are taking place in the public sector, which I'm afraid to say is at this apex is headed by the oath in the Oval Office. But having said that, there are some interesting developments, exciting developments. I was very pleased to see how the West Coast Longshore shut down ports from Seattle to San Diego in solidarity with Juneteenth and Black Lives Matter. This was just a few weeks ago. But in the course of this discussion, where you hear these terms multiracial, multinational, I would urge and encourage those remaining to look at my historical analysis of the construction of this relatively new identity called whiteness. And given that the last question made reference to the Afro-Latino community, the question that someone should have asked a long time ago, which is, how was it that Spain, which had a first mover's advantage in terms of sponsoring Columbus, did not necessarily dominate this part of North America? And how was it that England, a minor kingdom on the fringes of Europe, comes from behind to surge ahead, causing us to be sitting here speaking their language? I go into some detail to explain how that happens, but the short answer is, to return to what I mentioned a moment ago, that this was taking place in the era of religious conflict. Catholic Spain and the scrappy underdog, which is Protestant England. The Catholic powers were trying to overthrow Protestant England. That was the import of the Spanish Armada in 1588, for example, which came within a whisker of overthrowing Queen Elizabeth. And in a creative adaptation, the scrappy underdogs moved from religion as a qualifier for settlement, and in fact, there probably wouldn't have been enough Protestants to go around, to a pan-European project, which morphs into whiteness, which morphs into white supremacy, which creates a broader basis for settler colonialism, incorporating those it had been oppressing, including Irish Catholics. I mentioned a moment ago how they expelled the Jewish population in 1291, and then leading to 1776, which people are still telling us was a great leap forward for humanity, even though it was a great leap backwards, clearly, for the Native American population and for the African population. I mean, that's how seductive this whole process of whiteness and white supremacy has been, that even those who consider themselves to be progressive still pray at its altar. Let me stop there.
Well, we appreciate your wisdom. Can you speak to the character of, you've already mentioned the anti-Chinese attack. Can you speak to the character of the current Red Scare and anti-communism today, especially within the leftist and Black movement, and how can it be faced?
Well, I would like to think that trend is dissipating. That's what I would like to think. I would like to think that since May 25th, 2020, and the killing of George Floyd, the lynching of George Floyd, that this has helped to engender a new domestic situation, perhaps an even new global situation, vis-a-vis anti-US imperialism, which then has knock-on effects in terms of eroding anti-communism. This is what I would like to think. Notice the hesitation in my language, but I know that, I would like to leave us with some optimism. So let me just leave it there. I would like to think that trend is on the downswing.
With regards to whiteness, is there someone whose analysis of 20th century dynamics in the US is most closely aligned with your conclusions about whiteness' much earlier roots? Sakai, Ignatieff, and the race trader writers, someone else?
Well, I mean, there's been a lot of writing on whiteness, and I would encourage our friends on the left, including the Communist Party, to catch up with this literature, because a lot of it is very enlightening. And I would point to Neil Painter's book, History of White People. It's very interesting. I would point to the work of David Roediger, who, by the way, used to co-edit books with Philip Foner. He's made a whole career out of writing about whiteness.
Would you spell his last name?
Roediger. I mean, there's a whole cottage industry about this. I mean, I've contributed to this subject. I mean, some of our friends, they want to normalize that category, act like it was always like it's Homo sapien. It's something that's maybe always been here, and it's not even worth looking at because it has no beginning, it has no end, but it does have a beginning,
Yes.
And I think it'll have an end.
Do you think the rightward tide of Eastern Europe, Eastern and Central Europe will continue?
That's unclear. I mean, I guess you saw the Polish elections where the Law and Justice Party of the right wing won by a hair. And given the fact that their comrade right-wingers are still in power in Budapest, speaking of Viktor Orban, it's going to be very difficult for the European Union to take stern administrative measures against Warsaw because it requires a unanimous vote within the EU. And obviously Budapest is going to vote against it because Budapest doesn't want the EU to come after it. At the same time, it's clear that Warsaw is sort of setting itself up to be a toady of US imperialism. I mean, you've heard the talk about Fort Trump being established in Poland, and it's very interesting, as you can tell by all this gray hair, I happened to be around during the Cold War. And speaking of some of our friends on the left, I recall all this cheerleading for solidarity, for these anti-communists who ultimately surged to power. But now these folks are quiet as a church mouse, as the people they helped to boost into power are talking about Fort Trump. And of course, this represents a mortal danger to the European Union, which realizes that because, of course, Poland is quite anti-Berlin. Now, of course, you given the ravages that Germany inflicted on Poland some decades ago, you can sort of understand that. But in 2020, it's not necessarily manifesting itself positively. And that's one of the reasons, like in Bolton's book, Bolton keeps quoting Trump to the effect of saying, the EU is as bad as China, just smaller. Obviously, he has a real thing about the European Union. Apparently, in a meeting with Chancellor Merkel, he threw something at her. Now, that might have something to do with the fact that she's a woman and he's a sexist, but still, to throw something at a head of state, head of government is quite something. And I think that that's one of the reasons why France has been talking lately about a European army, because Mr. Trump is always bashing NATO and saying, trying to get the European countries to contribute more to NATO. And so France says, which is, of course, not part of the military wing of NATO in any case, it's talking about, okay, fine, we'll create a European army, which then presents significant dangers to international peace and security, particularly since Britain, now that it's in the process of Brexit, probably is going to wind up in a very curious reversal of history as being sort of a puppet of its former colony. I mean, being a puppet of US imperialism. That's the import of the Huawei decision that's taken a day or two ago. And, you know, quite frankly, the conservatives, they've maneuvered themselves into this position because they need backup. I mean, Britain is what, this middle range power of 60, 65 million. It needs backup. And so it feels it can get backup from 330 million strong United States of America. But this presents a mortal danger to the European Union and a mortal danger to international peace and security.
Coming back to Black communists on this side of the Atlantic, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the major historical divisions and conflicts between and among Black communists over the course of the century, and what we can learn from their disagreements and what lessons we can learn from them.
Well, many disagreements, disagreements over the Black Belt thesis, which I've already articulated when it was jettisoned in the 1950s. That caused quite a bit of controversy. Many people felt that it should not have been jettisoned. There were less significant conflicts about the Soviet intervention in Hungary in 1956. Less significant controversies about the Soviet intervention in Czechoslovakia in Prague in 1968. To a certain degree, and even lesser significance with regard to positions toward China post 1956, which of course culminates in the early 1970s with Nixon's trip to China, which was truly of world historic significance, and I would dare say has boomeranged against US imperialism. So that's just a few examples.
We have a teacher who is teaching Baldwin's Fire Next Time to first-year undergraduates this fall. And he said, I just read The Fire This Time to try to understand and contextualize the Minneapolis uprising. I'm wondering what advice you might have for reflecting on the Minneapolis uprising with Baldwin's text. How does the Minneapolis uprising relate to Watts and Los Angeles 92?
Well, obviously the connective thread is the police. That's the through line. And once again, I think by raising this question, which has rapidly gained traction, of defund the police, which in many ways is talking about removing the police from activity where a man or woman with a gun is not only unnecessary, but can inflame the situation, such as dealing with noise complaints, such as writing accident reports after an auto accident, such as dealing with the mentally challenged. This is a demand that many city councils, such as in Los Angeles, are considering favorably. So that's a difference in the sense that I wish that in the 1960s, someone had been able to build a movement around defund the police and they did not have to wait until 2020. And certainly Minneapolis is in the forefront of that movement. So I'll stop there.
Some within the Black Lives Matter movement have allied themselves with the Hong Kong movement, claiming that they have parallels in the struggle and should ally and build a global abolitionist movement. How do you make sense of this in the context of the US war drive towards China? As a historian, could you debunk or speak to why our struggles are not parallel with Hong Kong or the Uyghurs or whichever minority nationality the US or the West cries crocodile tears over? And how do we make sense of how this strange coupling could harm the Black liberation movement if it goes unchecked?
Well, the questioner might know that I lived in Hong Kong. I was a professor at the University of Hong Kong, 1999, the year 2000. I wrote a book on the Pacific War, based heavily on Hong Kong archives. I follow Hong Kong politics closely to this very day. I listen every Sunday, and I recommend it to the questioner, to RTHK Radio 3 Hong Kong for the English language minority. It's very informative, particularly say 7 p.m. Central till about 8 p.m. Central. So having said that, this movement, which has now engendered this so-called national security law in the Hong Kong legislature, was a direct response to these rather raucous protests, which included, setting people on fire and invading the legislature and vandalizing the legislature. And a lot of these leaders were teenagers. Many of them, of course, were embraced by Senator Ted Cruz of Texas. As a matter of fact, Senator Ted Cruz even marched with the demonstrators last year, fashionably attired in black. He's your senator from Texas, you might recall.
He marched with the Hong Kong demonstrators?
Yes, absolutely he did. And of course, many of the leaders of the protests, they march with US flags, they sing the Star Spangled Banner, which, by the way, is now coming in under attack because, as you may know, the third stanza in very explicit terms denounces and castigates the Black population for reasons, if you paid attention to what I said in my opening statement concerning Black people helping to burn down Washington, D.C. That's the reason why Francis Scott Key, a slave owner, denounces the Negroes during the US national anthem. But anyway, the Hong Kongers, these youth, they're singing the song, apparently unaware of what they're saluting. So it's clear that US imperialism would like to make Hong Kong into this century's Berlin. I'm sure you recall during the Cold War, the standoff between East Berlin and West Berlin and et cetera, and how it was a flashpoint during the Cold War. And so this is the idea with regard to Hong Kong. The problem is that the US imperialism is heavily dependent upon the People's Bank of China buying US Treasury bills. That's how it keeps Washington, D.C. afloat, by the way. And if the United States tries to harm Hong Kong, it may wind up harming its own supporters, who, by the way, as already alluded to, many of whom are thinking about moving to London, they're thinking about moving to Sydney, moving to Auckland, for example. So it's a very complicated political situation. But I alluded to some of the critiques I made of China in my books. I won't repeat any of those critiques here. But if any of you want an understanding, as a matter of fact, since this seems to be an elongated conversation, let me draw a parallel between, and finish a point I left hanging about why it is we're sitting here speaking English. So basically, the English in the 1500s cut a deal with the Ottoman Turks were the major antagonists of the Catholic powers. Of course, you know, you might have seen this, the article the other day in the press about how President Erdogan in Turkey, he just converted what used to be a Christian church until 1453 in what is now Istanbul. Then it became a Muslim mosque. And then under Ataturk in the 1930s, it became a museum. He just kind of converted it back to a Muslim mosque. So the Ottoman Turks were on the march. It was thought that their next stop would be the Vatican. Their next stop would be the Iberian Peninsula. And so when the Spanish started sailing across the Atlantic in 1492, in some ways they were trying to flee the Ottoman Turks. But then the Protestant English come along. Of course, Martin Luther ignites Protestantism in 1517. And they cut a deal with the Ottoman Turks against the Catholic powers, against their fellow Christians, for example. Now, ultimately, I guess it pays off, quote unquote. But in my book, I draw an analogy. And pardon me, but I don't think too many people are here, so I can say this. I only see you. I might just be talking to you as far as.
No, you're talking to a lot of people.
I see.
A lot of questions and a lot of comments.
So in the 1970s, when Kissinger and Nixon instigate this masterstroke of diplomacy, and they go to China and turn China against the Soviet Union, which is a real turning point in world history. As a matter of fact, I don't want to be sarcastic to my Chinese friends, but you know, supposedly the Chinese leadership is studying the Soviet Union example so that what happened to the Soviet Union doesn't happen to China. But it reminds me of the Latin American joke, which is, why is the United States more politically stable than most of the countries in Latin America? Because there's no US embassy in Washington, for example. So, you know, the Chinese don't necessarily have to worry that much about having the fate of the Soviet Union befall them, because there's no Soviet Union right now. And it seems as if Moscow and China are becoming as close as lips and teeth. Although in Bolton's book, although I think Bolton is just trying to start some mess, as they say in the streets. In Bolton's book, he says, you know, by the way, Moscow has been talking to us about their worries about China. Now, you know, that doesn't comport with press reporting, but anyway, he says that 2 times at least. He also says more than once that he feels that Steve Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, and even Jared Kushner might be in the pocket of China, because China has bought off a lot of the US elite. I mean, that's what happens when you have a lot of money. But in any case, to get back to this thread, I think that Washington making this deal with China in order to encircle the Soviet Union has boomeranged the same way that when the Ottoman Turks cut this deal with England against the Catholic powers, not envisioning that this minor kingdom on the outskirts of Europe would somehow surge into the lead and start the British Empire and become a power for hundreds of years until they overplayed their hand and were cast into the dustbin of history.
Wow. We're, oh gosh, I had another question. And where did it go? Let's see. Could you speak to how and this may be bringing us to a close, could you speak to how the Communist Party oriented towards, trained, and uplifted Black women, since we're talking Claudia Jones School of Political Education?
Well, of course, I'm sure you're familiar with Claudia Jones's article, which helps to ignite the whole concept of triple jeopardy. That is to say, Black women facing jeopardy on grounds of ancestry or race, class, gender, which in some ways prefigures the very fashionable movement towards intersectionality, which which we're
Yes.
which we're grappling with today. And certainly, I think that if you look at an organization like Sojourners for Truth and Justice, which was ignited by Black women communists, but it provided a forum for them in the 1950s to organize independently, including Louise Thompson Paterson, Shirley Graham Du Bois et al. Eric McDuffie has written an entire book about that organization, published some years ago.
Where was this organized? Where in the?
Oh, New York.
Okay.
But it was national. Eric McDuffie, as I said, has written an entire book about it.
Okay.
I think that it provided a vehicle for Black women, communists and non-communists alike, to have an organization of their own through which they could not only sharpen their own organizational skills without necessarily encountering the stumbling blocks of sexism and male supremacy, at least not in the organizing room,
Right.
but also to focus on cases that could bring more Black women into the ranks. We still need a book on the Rosalie Ingram case, which the Civil Rights Congress adopted in the late 1940s. It should have been a movie by now, if there was any justice. This Black woman, tenant farmer in Georgia, rebuffs the aggressive overtures of a Euro-American male landlord. And then, because of her aggressive rebuffing of him, winds up going on trial. And then once again, it becomes an international movement. You could look at my book on the Civil Rights Congress to get details about the case, or if you want to write a book about the case, just follow my footnotes. The papers are at New York at the Schomburg whenever it opens. So I think during
her name was Rosalie.
Rosalie Ingram, I-N-G-R-A-M. And then, of course, somebody needs to write a book about the mothers of the Scottsboro Nine, who traveled the world on the Communist Party's dime and developed political skills and acumen and speaking ability, and were very instrumental in terms of the defense of their sons. So, that's enough for now.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and spending time with us and answering our questions. Is there something that we didn't ask you, or that you would like to share with us before we begin to close?
Well, you mentioned my book on the 16th century, and as I said, it deals with the roots of slavery, white supremacy, settler colonialism, and capitalism, the four horsemen of the apocalypse. If you're interested,
the title of the book is
The Dawning of the Apocalypse.
Oh, okay.
And my next book will be published by a firm I'm sure you're familiar with, International Publishers.
Yes.
And it concerns boxing.
Oh my.
The bittersweet science, racism, racketeering, and the political economy of boxing. I think that even if you're not a sports fan, even if you abhor boxing, I think you'll find this book intriguing.
Yes, yes. I believe I am supposed to make some announcements at this point, but I don't see the announcements that I'm supposed to make. So if someone would either put them in the chat. I know I'd like to invite people to visit the Claudia Jones School for Political Education Facebook page soon and often. And we will post upcoming events and discussions there. Let's see. Also, there is Claudia Jones School on Instagram, and Claudia Jones EDU on Twitter. And I think with that, I'm going to invite our cultural artists for this evening to join us. Let me see if there's one more note I need to.
I'm looking at these messages. I keep hearing, it's too late now that I'm reading it. People are complaining about the audio.
Yeah, that